Welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, the podcast that helps aircraft owners and aviation businesses learn and understand the complex world of aviation insurance and risk management. From the basic principles of aviation insurance to risk management techniques and updates on the aviation insurance market, the Aviation Insurance Podcast is your guide to traverse the world of aviation insurance. Now, here's your host, Tim Bonnell.
Well, welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, and today I want to talk about a subject that really is something everyone in the aviation business, the aviation insurance business, needs to be aware of, and so often aircraft owners and aviation businesses need a higher limit of liability than they're able to get from their primary insurance carrier, and so oftentimes, in many circumstances, excess liability is an option for them. And so today, I want to invite a friend of mine on, Jason Riley. Jason and I have met through the Aviation Insurance Association and been affiliated for many years. And I got into the business and was trained by my father, and he got into the business, was trained by his father-in-law. So it kind of are in second generation as well. And so anyway, Jason leads the Minger Underwriting Services, which is the only program that solely offers aviation excess liability over at least $1 million of combined single limit coverage. The concept was born from an Aviation Insurance Association meeting in the Minger Hotel by Ray Hall and Tom Bradshaw. Tom being Jason's father-in-law, great man, great aviation insurance man too. And now the program has been around for over 25 years with Allianz as the issuing company and the same reinsurance partners from the inception, which speaks volumes to a company's success. Jason has over 20 years of experience in the financial services and insurance industries, with at least 15 on both the brokerage and excess liability underwriting sides of the aviation insurance market. He's a proud alum of Baylor University for his bachelor and the University of Kansas for his MBA. He served on the education committee of the Aviation Insurance Association, which I'm thankful for, and is a former board member of the Angel Flight South Central and Chapel Hill Children's School, which is part of Whitechapel UMC, where he served as chairman of the board. So, Jason, thank you for joining us here today on the Aviation Insurance Podcast. We're glad to have you.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Well, as we kind of led in, we are here to talk about excess liability for aircraft and the aviation insurance market. And so let's just get started at the very basics for people who don't understand this. What is excess liability and why do aircraft owners need it?
Yeah. So, one of the key differences, and a lot of times owners will say, well, I have umbrella insurance that should cover me. And I think the two main differences on this is, number one, most umbrellas, as you know, will exclude aviation. And number two, umbrellas are really designed to sit over multiple lines of coverage and drop down to whatever limit you might have. Aviation excess is very specific. It sits over your aviation liability, and it sits over a specified primary layer, and then you have a specified excess layer. So those are kind of the key differences. And I think one of the important things for owners to understand is that their umbrella almost certainly doesn't step in the event of an aviation liability claim.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because many people who own aircraft have, high net worth. They obviously want to protect their assets, their futures. And so a lot of times, depending on the type of aircraft they're flying or depending on their pilot experience, they may be only able to achieve a certain limit of liability. And as you said, people have personal umbrella policies, and that, provides increased or excess limit over a handful of policies. Those certain policies are excluded. And as is usual with anything aviation, anything aircraft related is typically going to be one of the first things that excluded. And so, as brokers, we go and look for specific excess liability applicable to that policy. What are the challenges in purchasing excess liability insurance?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is typically by the time it's getting to an excess layer, you've maxed out what the primary is going to do. And that's typically due to some sort of adverse selection situation, whether it's the type of aircraft or, pilot qualifications, what have you. So by the time it gets to us, you kind of run out of runway, so to speak. So we're trying to find a way to justify giving that excess layer. And those hurdles primarily for us are, it has to be a smooth limit. And what makes Minger a little bit unique is we're one of the only ones that will write excess below a 5 million primary. Most of the
Yep.
other markets want at least a 5 million primary. And then it just gets into the typical underwriting process. The good thing for us is, we know the market really well on the primary side. So if we see a risk that is with a quality carrier, with a quality broker, it makes it somewhat easy for us to just know, what, the primary market's just capped out. And so it makes sense for excess to step in at this point.
Yeah, and I agree that the biggest challenge is obviously we talked about a smooth limit, and those who aren't familiar with that insurance jargon, smooth limit meaning there's no passenger sub limit. So for a lot of a lot of pilots who are new or they're transitioning into a bigger aircraft, many primary insurers will only offer a limit of, let's say, $1 million each occurrence, uh, which is a combined single limit for bodily injury, property damage, and passenger legal liability. But then they'll also have a passenger sublimit saying of that, 1 million combined single limit, each passenger is only eligible for up to $100,000 of that coverage. When that happens, it's no longer a smooth limit, and there aren't any aviation insurance excess liability policies that will write a policy with a sublimit like that. So getting the smooth limit obviously is the biggest challenge. And I know you and I've talked about just briefly, there are certain types of aircraft, certain types of uses that most insurers typically won't write. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, we have some limitations within our treaty on certain aircraft, like experimentals, for instance. Um, But again, normally what you're going to see is if you're running into challenges getting that limit on the primary, those same challenges are going to transfer into our process as well. But normally, if you can secure a smooth limit on the primary, there's some room to maneuver with a few exceptions. Um, on the sublimit, I will say, there have been some times where we will do, and I'm going to speak insurance jargon again, like a
Sure.
BI and PD only, a bodily injury and property damage only excess, where, we've had some contractual situations where you need some higher limits to solve a contract, but they don't necessarily care about the passenger liability. So we'll exclude passenger liability altogether. But those get into really specific situations. The key is there for people to understand that there are potential solutions if you just ask
Yeah. Well,
questions.
yeah, the sublimit applies to passenger legal liability, so excluding that and doing just bodily injury and property damage seems to make sense, but I'm guessing it, like you said, it probably has to be special circumstances.
Certainly.
Now, under your program, Menger, you talked about you're unique in that you'll do excess over $1 million combined single limit without a passenger limit, without the exceptions we talked about. How much excess can an aircraft owner purchase through your program?
Yeah. The capacity for Minger it's a $10 million facility, and we typically, as a rule of thumb, you can get maybe 1.5 to 2 times the primary limit. So if you have $1 million limit, usually the most we'll do is 1 million of excess the first year, and then maybe in the following years we would go to 2x of 1. 3x of 2 is probably our largest tranche of coverage. People like to get to a $5 million limit. And then 5x of 5 and 10x of 10. People like those round numbers. So that's kind of those three tranches are our three largest tranches.
Yeah, and that's really helpful information. And obviously, you get into some commercial aircraft and aviation operations where, excess limits in the primary market can start at, 50 million, excess of 50 million. So, a lot of general aviation insurers will get into those higher limit excess, but they're going to have, as you talked about, a higher underlying requirement. And then obviously, they're going to underwrite it accordingly. So it'll be, obviously not individual aircraft owners with a piston aircraft per se getting, that type of excess operation, but excess liability is a big, it's bigger than just aircraft. Obviously there's certain types of excess that you can get into, adding a little, in some cases, some excess liability for business auto or employer's liability on your CGL policy. But today we just really wanted to focus on, that getting additional limit, the excess liability
Right.
for aircraft, yeah, and aviation. So, a lot of times, people will, ask, well, how much liability coverage should I have? And obviously, we can't ever answer that. And so I guess I just throw you the question: is there ever too much liability
Nah.
coverage?
Well, as any good insurance person might say, I don't know if you can ever have too much, right? But uh,
Right.
conversation I have pretty frequently these days is, we used to kind of say, if you have 5 million a seat, 5 to 7 million a seat, like you should feel pretty good. Um, but as the market has tightened and as we've seen these sort of nuclear verdicts evolve, I mean, the question really becomes how much limit do you need to be able to rest at night and feel like you've got enough coverage? It's a really silver bullet question that I think is different for probably every single insured. That's part of what I love about this business is, um, there's really not a cookie cutter approach to a whole lot of stuff. That's where I think that, for the people that are watching this, certainly aircraft owners, that's where it's important to think about your insurance broker as more than just somebody shopping for the cheapest rate, and having somebody that's knowledgeable and can really walk you through those things, get you the right limit, whether you need excess or not.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there are, considerable part of our audience are in the aviation insurance business. And, a lot of times people know how to get a quote, but they don't really understand everything involved with the policy and the risk. And you really have to dive deep and get involved, learn all about aviation insurance, read insurance policies, attend conferences like the Aviation Insurance Association, take the education courses, because it really is. There's so many individual issues when it comes to excess liability. Yeah, I mean each one's separate, and the aviation insurance broker really is should be a part of that risk management team for yourself. Now, when it comes to how much liability should you purchase, I mean your broker really can't answer that certainly on his own. As much as you can afford is a great answer, but really that part of that conversation in a risk management team goes to your legal team and to your accounting team, your CPAs, because, what are your finances? A lot of people, have assets they have to protect. And so the more liability, the better. Then, obviously there are legal structures where people try to insulate themselves from liability, but anymore. And that's really a legal question that you and I can't answer. But obviously, we've seen, in different jurisdictions that, that more and more they try to penetrate corporate veils and so on and so forth. So, all that's a challenge. And that's why it's important to have a risk management team when you're thinking about a liability insurance. It's more than just what your broker thinks. What is your, how is your aircraft owned and structured? What are your tax and legal considerations as you try to pick a limit?
One thing I'll tag on to that is, I talk to a lot of owner pilots who will say, well, I put it in LLC, so I'm not really worried about it. And I think that it's also important to make sure to clarify that, the LLC is a fantastic tool for a lot of things. But if you're a PIC and you're manipulating flight controls, there's still a level of personal liability there that you can only insulate so much. And so that's where I think the conversation of excess, particularly for owner pilots, becomes really important. So I just thought I'd tag that on there.
Oh, that's a really good point. I appreciate you sharing it. So, excess, sits on top of the primary layer of coverage. And so, the primary insurance company, they place the primary policy, they address the front end of the claim, and they handle that claim. But obviously excess comes into picture when there's a large liability claim and they think that that initial limit's going to be exhausted, and we'll get into excess, the need for the excess coverage. So how does that work in terms of a claim and
Yeah.
regarding the primary and the excess?
Yeah. So, for Minger in particular, it's a following form policy. So it's a pretty short policy. Will only write over approved primary aviation markets in the United States. And those are companies that we feel comfortable with how they adjust claims, how they view claims. And then, if and when a claim occurs, the primary market will lead the adjustment process, but Minger will get involved in its own separate capacity and do its own investigation and prepare for the potential of getting to the excess layer. In some events, it gets settled inside the primary and it doesn't even trigger the excess. And other events, then, it still acts as its own insurance company, and it's going to respond however the primary does, but there's still a level of determination to make sure that there is personal liability on that policy. The Meager policy is a little different in that you can only list specific named insured. That's not as broad in terms of additional insureds on as a primary. So other markets, like you talked about, I mean, there are other markets out there, particularly that write at the higher limits, and those policy forms are a little bit different. They're a little bit longer and have their own coverage language that has to be interpreted in the case of a claim. So.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you talked about following form. That literally means, we're going to sit over the terms and conditions of the primary policy, maybe with a few exceptions as it applies to insureds. Whereas, some of them will have their own policy that may vary at some length. And so I think that you pointed out just working with a good underlying, carrier that has a good, claims management history. I think that's always important, whether or not you're getting excess. And so, but I think it's good to highlight the fact that as an excess insurer, you're looking at who that underlying carrier is because of the experience you've had with them in the claims market. Now, we're just trying to keep this to the basics of excess liability, but when it gets into large aircraft operations, I mean, it can get pretty complicated. I mean, you can have a quota share placement, meaning we have 5, 10, 15 carriers sharing the risk for a certain part of the policy, and then an excess layer and a second excess layer, and it can get complicated. And so on large aircraft operations, obviously, you really have to know what you're doing, but it's a great tool to help gain additional liability coverages, and it can be used in a number of capacities. But for the most part, individual aircraft owners, they're probably looking at one option. Obviously, if they have $1 million limit of liability without a passenger sublimit, for the most part, Menger's going to be their best option. As we get into larger aircraft operations and larger limits, then they have to look at the standard market and the underwriting process, and obviously the cost associated with it goes up. And so, what else, just, from your program, in addition to, as you said, you have to kind of underwrite each one, each specific account, they're each unique, but what are some of the factors that go into the pricing from a very high level to the excess liability policy?
Well, it's as you were saying that, it kind of triggered a thought that one of the things that we run into pretty frequently, again, kind of back to the umbrella discussion, is most consumers, insurance consumers, are used, umbrella pricing is relatively inexpensive on personal lines, or what have you.
Right. Yep.
And they kind of assume that will translate into the excess, but oftentimes it does not. It's actually oftentimes even more expensive than the primary layer. And the reason for that is, again, the legal climate that we're in. I mean, thankfully, most of the accidents that happen don't necessarily trigger a liability claim, but in the event that there is one, unfortunately, we're seeing those situations escalate. So, the main things that we're looking at are pilot qualifications. How is the primary market viewing this? What kind of limits are available there on the primary? Certainly, there are certain types of aircraft that are going to be off limits, but those are going to be fewer and further between. I think the biggest thing is, it is just for people to know and understand that there is an option out there for higher limits. If you need them, all you have to do is make sure to ask, make sure to let your broker know that, hey, is there any higher limit available? It's a great tool for owners to protect themselves. It's a great tool for brokers to protect themselves against potential, E&O situation where maybe they didn't offer that are available to their clients. So, I don't know, those are kind of
No, that's a good point. But I was also curious because, a lot of times in primary underwriting, the number of seats obviously comes into play.
Yeah.
And then obviously the propulsion type, whether it's a turbine aircraft or a piston aircraft, a lot of that comes in the whole. But how do either of those factors play into the excess liability?
Yeah,
rate?
it's all very, very similar. At the base level, we look at whether it's a recip piston engine or not. Is it a fixed, and then it graduates up. Are they instrument rated pilot? Are they not an instrument rated pilot? Is it a retractable aircraft? It's multi-engine aircraft. Then once you get into turboprop and jet engines, it's a whole other underwriting process where we have established minimums that have to be met before any quotes are released. Certainly, as the hard markets happen, what we've really seen is where a lot of owner-flown risks, particularly owner-flown turbine risks, had some higher limits in the primary market that were available. As those limits have been taken back, that's really where the excess market has become important. There's some quota share opportunity there, as you mentioned, but then also, what we've seen is this need for owner pilots who are flying CJs or, really high valued airplanes where all of a sudden their limits are getting dialed back. Again, and seating does, the number of potential souls on board the aircraft is a direct impact on liability rate.
Yeah, no, that's good. And yeah, I mean, as we talk about a harder underwriting market, obviously most insureds, aircraft owners, aviation operators have seen increases in premium, going back to 2018. We had about, I don't know, how many years was that from like 2006 to 2018 of sharply declining prices,
Right.
much looser, underwriting guidelines, training requirements, and then they'd offer considerably higher limits of liability. And so as these premiums were going up, they also were retracting the amount of the limits of liability they were offering. So yeah, I think that obviously in this market, that's having excess liability, having a program like yours is been a very big asset to the market. So we're very thankful to have it. Is there anything else, just in general or related to excess liability that I haven't asked, that any thoughts you have as we get ready to close our time here today?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it. I think the key is to know that it's available. And as owners and pilots, I mean, it's really the same conversation that you're having from primary to excess. I mean, the goal is to make yourself the safest pilot possible. And the more that you can portray that to the market, the more it impacts your rate and the more limit that's available to you, whether it's a combination of primary and excess or even just on the primary. And to me, the more detail you can provide in that regard, the better. Oftentimes we have folks who are like, well, I didn't think to disclose that I went to, AOPA, a safety summit or what have you. And, all of those things matter, because the beauty of aviation insurance to me is that it's always going to be part art and part science. And part of that process is painting the picture of how do you operate differently than the next person.
Yeah, I love how you put that in art, because that's exactly what we say, help us to paint the best picture for you, provide any safety training, anything like that you can that will help us paint the best picture to the underwriters. And so that's something aircraft owners, the aviation businesses can do, is to pursue the safety, pursue training, certifications that evidence that, and provide that information to their broker, because that helps paint the best picture, to go with the art side of the science. And so, just on behalf of the industry, Jason, thank you for you and your team, and for having this program that really, as you said, fits a need in the market that wasn't there before the program existed, and for continuing to keep it successful. Obviously, you'll see markets come in or programs come in and go, and to have such a long, history speaks volumes of having a very positive program that's obviously priced fairly, as it can be, while still keeping it successful to remain viable in the market. So we're thankful to have that, and I'm certainly appreciate your service on the Aviation Insurance Association Education Committee, and to the industry. And I thank you for your time today, and just real appreciative of what you're doing, and keep up the good work. And we'll hopefully see more and more excess liability submissions coming your way with this information that we put out in today's episode. So thank you for being here,
Yeah,
Jason.
you bet. Appreciate you having me. And just so you know, there will be a new portal coming out within the next couple of months where submitting and getting those quotes will be a whole lot easier. So we'll make that announcement soon. So thanks a lot. It's good to be here, Tim.
Great. Yeah, that's even better news. So Well, that's all for this episode. Join us again next time as we continue navigating the waypoints in aviation insurance. So until then, enjoy clear skies and unlimited visibility.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes, and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aeris Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit aerisinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer: these episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.